So many of the poems you'll have read begin with the point of view of the lyric eye, and it's presumed by the reader that this eye is interesting. Well, Puritan poets think of that eye as a damned sinner. While we have souls inside of us, implanted in us by God, everything else is dragging us down, is confusing us, is confuting our senses, is leading us to assert ourselves. And what I've just been describing is sin. So if what you are composed of so much is sin, then it's not as though it's necessarily a good to be expressing all of that. Expressing all of that is more like a kind of excretion. I mean, and excretion is in fact a process that Edward Taylor will return to again and again to describe the problem with his own poetry. We should also think back to our past discussion of Puritan disapproval of the Catholic Church and by extension of the Church of England. Some of the things that Puritans rejected, as you may remember, were the beauty of the way in which the Church would elevate the soul by, in some way, stimulating the senses. There's stained glass windows, there's frescoes, you know what I mean, there's gold everywhere, the priests are dressed in vestments, the air is perfumed with incense. All of that beauty and all of that sensory pleasure that's bestowed by the Church, our Puritans are rejecting. What's left is the poem as it allows us a certain kind of spiritual exercise, right? Which is to say, first, a kind of encounter through internal colloquy by talking to yourself, and the tradition of this goes all the way back to St. Augustine and his Confessions. The poem allows you a kind of internal dialogue with yourself that helps you get honest, right? Helps you get true with yourself. The poem is, in that way, it's an instrument of correction, right? The poem is an instrument of correction. Poetry, I thought of this morning, poetry is a kind of rehab. You go into the poem not because you've got anything really good to share with the world, not because you would presume to add beauty to the world, but because you have a spiritual job to do. And that job involves figuring out what's wrong with you, getting real consciousness of the distance between you and God's creation. So I just want to give you a few examples before we turn together to discussing Anne Bradstreet, who is a poet who's using the poet to work through, right? To work through problems. It's not as though one feels resolution very often in a poem of Anne Bradstreet's. One often feels a lot of tension. She'll run through a lot of options, none of which seem quite viable, or she'll have completed something, say a book, which looks to her like an utter abomination and failure. So we'll be talking about her in a minute, but a little more context will, I think, be useful to us.